Welcome to The Explainer. We're about to dive into a question that really gets to the very heart of the Catholic Church's identity. Is it this unchanging fortress of timeless truth, or is it more of a living community on a journey, something that evolves with history? Now, this isn't just some dusty academic debate. No, it's a tension that helps explain some of the biggest, most talked about changes happening in the Church today.
So where do we start? Well, with a puzzle that a lot of people are grappling with. How is it even possible for two popes, right, successors in the very same office, to put out teachings on a core doctrine that seem to point in completely opposite directions? This question is really the key that unlocks our whole topic.
Okay, so let's look at the specific case that brings this all into sharp focus. On one side, you've got Pope John Paul II's teaching in Familiaris Consortio. It lays out a very clear, universal rule about communion for the divorced and remarried. But then on the other hand, the source we're examining points to Pope Francis's Amoris Laetitia, and it argues that this document opens the door to communion based on, individual situations and personal discernment. According to this analysis, this isn't some subtle shift. It's a fundamental break, a direct discontinuity with what was taught before.
So how could a change like that even happen? What gives? Well, the perspective we're exploring today argues that this isn't just a simple disagreement between two popes. It claims the real conflict comes from a much, much deeper philosophical current that's been bubbling under the surface for over 100 years. It's a worldview known as modernism. And this, right here, is the core of the whole argument. It's the idea that this tension exists because there are now two totally different ways of seeing the Church itself. So let's break down this fundamental divide.
So, on one side, we have the traditional view. The Church is the mystical body of Christ. You can think of it as a divine reality that exists in history, sure, but its essential nature isn't changed by history. But this other perspective, the one the source calls modernist, sees the Church as the people of God on a journey. And in this view, the Church is a fundamentally human community within history, and it's constantly being shaped and transformed by that journey through time. And you can imagine the implications for the very idea of truth are absolutely huge. I mean, if the Church is a timeless divine reality, then truth is this fixed deposit of faith. Kind of like a diamond, right? It's perfect and it doesn't change. But if the Church is an evolving community, well then truth itself has to be dynamic. It becomes something you have to constantly reinterpret through your lived experience and whatever's happening in the world at that moment. The very definition of truth is no longer set in stone.
So if your understanding of the Church and even truth itself can be so different, what's the glue? What holds everything and everyone together? This brings us to another really critical split, the source of unity itself.
Traditionally, unity is all about in credendo, which is just a fancy way of saying in believing. You and a saint from, say, the 3rd century are connected because you both profess the exact same unchanging creed. But this newer perspective, it's said to shift the whole foundation to in agendo, in acting. So here, unity isn't about what you believe, but about being on the same journey together, being part of the same action.
And this quote from the source we're exploring really just nails the idea. In this view, what truly matters is not a shared faith, but simply being in the same boat, sailing the sea of history. The journey itself, being in the boat, becomes the thing that unites everyone, not a shared map or belief in the same destination.
But hang on, where did this intense focus on action and journey even come from? It didn't just appear out of thin air. According to the source, its roots go deep into a major shift in modern philosophy. So let's dig into those roots a little bit.
The key concept here, the one you really need to get, is something called praxis. Now, it sounds all academic, but the idea is actually pretty straightforward. It's the belief that practical action and your real-world lived experience are more fundamental, more real, than any abstract ideas or timeless truths. Simply put, what we do is more real than what we believe.
And you can just see how this sets off a chain reaction, right? Step 1. You decide that praxis or action comes first. Okay, well, that leads you to step 2. Abstract truth now has to take a back seat. From there, step 3. Truth can only really be understood through what's happening right now in this historical moment. And what's the final, inevitable conclusion? Step 4. If your history and experience are always changing, then truth itself has to change right along with it.
And the consequence of all this thinking is just profound. Suddenly, pointing out a contradiction between a new teaching and an old one, well, it's not a valid argument anymore. The source highlights this amazing Italian phrase for it, arma spuntata. Your criticism has become a blunt weapon. It's totally ineffective. Because in this new way of thinking, the very idea that doctrine should be permanent has already been tossed out the window.
Now, the source material does not present this as some kind of neutral academic debate. Oh no. It frames the stakes as being incredibly high, and it draws on some of the strongest language you'll find in recent church history to make its point.
And to really hammer home just how seriously this was all once taken, the source brings up Pope St. Pius X. At the very beginning of the 20th century, he came out with this sweeping condemnation of modernism. And let me tell you, he did not mince words. He called it the synthesis of all errors, and even more graphically, the sewer of all heresies.
So why use such forceful, honestly shocking language? The argument being made is that the consequences are not just philosophical, they're deeply spiritual. From this point of view, if you swap out unchanging divine truth for a soft, malleable, human-centered truth, you risk undermining the entire foundation of the faith and, as this source claims, you put souls in real danger.
And so, the source brings its argument all the way back around, returning to that traditional view, with this absolutely beautiful quote from St. John Chrysostom. "The Lord loves the church and cares for it more than for heaven itself." And that's really the ultimate statement on the traditional view of the church as this cherished, divine reality, not just a boat lost at sea, but something more precious than creation itself.
So we've walked through one source's really powerful argument about a deep conflict of vision inside the church. But it leaves all of us, I think, with a much bigger, more universal question. How can any institution that's built on what it believes are timeless principles, how can it possibly navigate the powerful, changing currents of history without losing the very identity that makes it what it is? Now that's a challenge for the ages. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.